But Juan, it's like saying at the Capitol that, oh, the vast majority of people there were peaceful. What does that mean? It doesn't tell us that's true. The vast majority.
It's not true. The vast majority of the Capitol were not peaceful.
No, it's absolutely true. The vast majority of the people at the Capitol did engage in no violence, in
on
no
January
property.
6th.
Yes.
You got to read the book, Dan.
Talking to Juan Williams about his new book, New Prize for These Eyes, The Rise of America's Second Civil Rights Movement. But Juan, don't you think, let me phrase it this way. I think that there was a vast overreaction to the killing of George Floyd. I think it led to some very bad changes across the country with regard to defunding the police, treating the police poorly, et cetera. Do you think that may have backfired?
Oh, wait, defund the police. I don't think that you characterize it as overreaction. I thought, if that's what you're saying, I think that's right. But it's not the case that most people supported defunding the police. I never supported. I don't think most Democrats supported anything like that. I mean, John Lewis is gone, but I remember John Lewis and others saying, this is stupid. That's stupid. That's like talking, Stokely Carmichael talking about Black Power back in the 60s. It doesn't bring people to you. It tells them you're kind of crazy. You can't defund the police.
All right, so let's move on from defund. Let's even just talk about the fact that the police were attacked with a brush, right? A broad brush of saying across the country, a lot of the protests you're talking about were against police. And it wasn't just against the police officers involved. It was just against police in general. It was protesting against police officers. And again, I think that part of the reason Donald Trump got elected, not saying it was the driving force, it was the issue. I'm just saying part of the reason I think Donald Trump got elected was because there were a lot of people in this country who felt that the anti-police sentiment, the post-George Floyd protests and riots, were the beginning of something that a lot of people in this country felt was too much.
You got to read the book, Dan, because, I think a lot of what you're saying reflects a caricature of what took place. One of the things that strikes me is when people, studied those demonstrations, 90+% of them were nonviolent demonstrations.
But that doesn't mean anything.
It does because
it's like
Trump
saying at the
wants you to
Capitol,
believe that they were violent.
No, but Juan, it's like saying at the Capitol that, oh, the vast majority of people there were peaceful. What does that mean? It doesn't tell us that's true. The vast majority.
Not true. The vast majority of the Capitol were not peaceful.
No, it's absolutely true. The vast majority of the people at the Capitol did engage in no violence, in
on
no
January
property.
6th.
Yes.
What I saw with my eyes was people engaged in violence on January.
Some of them. But you look at the numbers, and there's no doubt that even you look at the number of people charged, and then there were all the people who weren't charged who were there. The numbers are overwhelmingly the case that the vast majority were peaceful. My point is using that statistic of, the vast majority of people were peaceful. If you have enough people that were violent, it doesn't matter that there were a lot of people who were peaceful. They ruin it for the others.
Well, that's true, but it doesn't ruin. And here's the thing about the marches after George Floyd. You said they were against police. I don't agree with that. I think they were for the idea of social justice and equity, that you can't just kneel on a man's neck for 9+ minutes and say, oh, yeah, he died of some medical condition, tell a lie about it. You can't do that. People in this country are going to have a reaction. And here's what I would say to you, Dan. When I looked at it for this book, the research, I realized, and again, given the kind of framework you just offered, it comes as a surprise to people that 2/3 of the people marching after George Floyd died were white people. Mm-hmm. The majority, overwhelmingly. These are not some far left, crazy radical.
Whoa. But they could also be far left and be white. I mean, you just gave me a racial statistic.
You can't tell me that 2/3 of that 26+ million people are all self-identified liberal activists. Not true, Dan. I think there are a lot of people in the suburbs, even small towns, rural areas in this country, who had a reaction to Floyd's murder as injustice. But here's the thing. As I said to you, you and I disagree. I think most of those marches were people of goodwill who simply wanted to stand up for that man's life and say a black life mattered, in much the way they said after Trayvon
I
Martin.
agree.
I mean, that's where
But
Black Lives Matter comes from.
yeah, except that the Trayvon Martin case was a lot more nuanced than the George Floyd case in terms of what happened. There's a reason that you're looking at me as if I'm crazy. There's a reason George Zimmerman was acquitted and the police officer involved in the George Floyd case was not. They are two very different cases with
Well, they're
totally
very
different
different.
facts. And one didn't involve police at all, by the way. They just involved,
The voluntary security guard.
Exactly.
Right, but what the argument was, and I think this is what you're missing, because I think you're lost in the weeds of, this is the factual basis.
Facts, the factual weeds. I'm lost in the factual weeds.
Because I think the message that came through was after the acquittal, when you see Black Lives Matter created by people who weren't even there, but are online on social media, who say, yeah, he's walking along in a hoodie, he's got the, the Skittles and the iced tea, and this guy stops him because he thinks this 17-year-old black kid looks suspicious to him for no reason. He engages the kid, and yet the security guard is found not guilty by a jury. And they're saying, my God, what is going on here? This is a child. If it was a white child, if it was Jan's child, wouldn't you be upset?
No.
Black life mattered.
I watched the trial, and I will tell you that anyone who watched the trial with blinders on as to the race, which was impossible in the connection with that case, but who watched that trial based on the injury that Zimmerman had on the back of his head, that was the dispositive point in the case as to what happened and why Zimmerman in the end was acquitted. I get it that people, if you want to just make it about black kid walking to get Skittles and white guy who approaches him, etc., if you want to make it that simple, sure. If you want to actually base it, and this is my point, is that a lot of the time in these protests, people aren't actually watching what happened in these cases. They aren't actually focusing on the details of the cases. And that's why when there are acquittals sometimes, there are these explosions because people didn't actually pay attention to the trials.
Well, to me, I think you're missing something pretty big here, which is that who caused this confrontation? Why was there a fight? And it's not because the kid engaged in some illegal activity or there was suspicion that he was plotting some criminal activity. Not at all.
Yep.
There was the volunteer security guard who confronted Trayvon Martin.
Yep.
But we can go down the line because, there are other incidents like this. We can start talking about what happened in Ferguson. We can talk about Breonna Taylor.
Well, you don't want to talk about Ferguson because if you talk about Ferguson, you're going to lose the argument, Juan.
No, I'm not.
You are. The bottom line is that case with Michael Brown, there is so much evidence that Michael Brown was the aggressor. And there's a reason that no one would bring charges in that, not even the feds, because they looked at the case and they reviewed the case. This is why I think it's important, Juan, that a guy like you, with the kind of platform you have, the history you have, the abilities that you have, to be able to just sort of push all of these things into one big bucket and just say, this is all part of a civil rights movement, as opposed to saying, here are the things that are really important. Here are the defining moments. And here are the places where maybe things went too far. Maybe this hurt the movement. And again, you're right. I haven't read the book yet, but I will tell you that I'll ask you, do you in the book, and again, the name of the book is New Prize for These Eyes, The Rise of America's Second Civil Rights Movement. Do you in this book talk about areas where you think maybe things went too far and that it hurt the movement?
Absolutely. And that's why you should read the book.
I will. No. Look,
I wish you had read the book before you interviewed me. But the point is, that if you read the book, you will see where I am highly critical of a lot of things that Black Lives Matter did that I think hurt them, including allowing this notion that they were somehow associated with a defund the police argument to take hold. Because what that meant was that critics were able to, again, move away from the focus, the real focus, the whole argument about we're in the midst of tremendous change in this country and we're looking for justice. And that kind of thing, I just thought as you were speaking, Dan, I think Dan has on a legal background glasses, that you're looking at this through, this is the fact case here, and this is this and this. And I think you're missing out on a lot of the power of narrative and social media and story in this moment. But, when you think about something like what happens in this country with regard to demographic change. When you think about what happens in this country when someone says an outright lie like, oh, I don't think he was born in this country, and it becomes the basis for a movement, does Dan then say, oh, that's not true. That's factually not true. This guy, Obama, was born in the United States.
Yes, Dan does.
And then, but does that stop the birther movement? Does that stop the building?
No.
And so what would Dan say? Because
so Dan would say people like Dan and Juan Williams should be out there trying to get people.
What I'm telling you is, if we go back to Michael Brown in Ferguson, where you said the fact base is he actually may have caused confrontation.
Yes.
I agree with you. But what you're missing, Dan, is, oh, wait a minute. They left his body on the street for 4+ hours in the midday sun in the middle of summer, and people were outraged, and people couldn't understand why you would treat a human being in this way.
But when you just talk about people are outraged, you can make the same arguments on the right? People are outraged about Merrick Garland. People are outraged about things that Trump tells. It doesn't mean that it's accurate. It doesn't mean that it's based on facts. And my point is, let's make sure that the outrage is based on accurate facts. I don't think that's putting on sort of legal blinders to things to say, let's people like you and me, who are viewed as, reasonable voices, that we get out there and we say, whoa, guys, hang on. Here are the facts on this and here are the facts on that. And I get your point.